Okay, just so everyone understands, this is essentially a Board of Selectmen meeting for Northborough, and these other committees are here to meet jointly to hear the presentation for informational purposes. Okay? Ready to go? And we're on. Good evening. My name is Jason Pro. I'm the chairman of the Northborough Board of Selectmen. We're meeting here jointly this evening. I call the Board of Selectmen meeting of June 4th, 2020 to order. We're meeting jointly with the K-8 School Administration and School Committee, with the Northborough Appropriations Committee, and with the Northborough Financial Planning Committee to go over a presentation of the revised budget proposed for fiscal year 2021. The agenda was posted on the website. There are various mechanisms for you to view it. If you refer to the agenda, live stream on YouTube, Zoom webinar link, cable access TV channels, Verizon 30 and Charter 192, and phone number 1-646-876-9923. Please refer to the agenda for the details about the meeting ID and password. This is an open meeting being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12th, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. The governor's order is listed at the top of our agenda. In order to mitigate transmission of COVID-19 virus, we've been advised and directed by the Commonwealth to suspend public gatherings. And as such, the governor's order suspends the requirement of the open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. This allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations of the meeting. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This is simply an informational presentation tonight, and there will not be any public comment. This meeting is being conducted by the Zoom application, and as mentioned, there are other avenues for you to view it. The supporting information for this presentation tonight, you can find the summary that will be presented on the Northborough website. If you go to the departments and select administration, and then, excuse me, on the administration page down, second item in the left menu from the bottom, you'll find the link for the revised budget proposal for 2021. That's the information that we will be going over this evening. Just some ground rules. In order to conduct the meeting in an orderly manner, I will introduce the speakers on the agenda. After they conclude their remarks, I'll go in order through the members of each of the assembled committees here to ask if anyone has any questions or comments they would like to make. Please hold your questions or comments until I call on you. Please also, people who are on the Zoom call here, please understand that you are on video, you are being seen. So just be mindful of that. You may want to keep your microphone muted throughout the meeting, except for the particular circumstances where you're speaking. Please direct all activity through me, the chair, in order to, as I said, conduct the meeting in an orderly manner. This is simply an informational meeting. There is no deliberation and no votes by any of the committees taking place tonight. This is expected to be the most detailed and comprehensive presentation of considerations for the revised budget. The meeting tonight will be followed by a Selectmen's meeting on Monday night, jointly with the Appropriations Committee. At that time, we will have a public hearing, so the public will be able to present their comments. However, at that meeting on Monday night, we will not be going through the budget in the same level of detail we will be going through it here tonight. And so for that reason, I encourage all citizens following this meeting at sometime tomorrow, you should have access to any of the materials that are presented and also the video replay of this meeting. I encourage everyone to watch this replay so that they go through, see the detail, and are prepared on Monday for any comments they might wish to offer at that time. With that, I think we're ready. I do need to go through, this is kind of a procedural matter, and walk through the list of attendees here who are connected as participants in the meeting. I'll first go through the members of the Board of Selectmen. I'm Jason Perot, Chairman of the Board. We also have Dawn Rand. Dawn, could you acknowledge? Can you unmute, Dawn?
Present.
Thank you. Tim Kalin.
Present.
Leslie Rattan.
Present, and if you could speak up, Jason, tonight, I'd appreciate it.
Yep, I will try my best. Julianne Hirsch.
Present.
Members of the Appropriation Committee, Rick Niebuhr, Vice Chair.
Present.
George Brenkel.
Present.
Janice Height.
Present.
And I'm scanning here, trying to see. I think that's all the members of the Appropriations Committee. Financial Planning Committee. Chair David DeVries.
Present.
Tom Spataro.
Present.
John Rappa.
Present.
Scott Rogers.
Present.
Michael Hodge.
Present.
And William Peterson.
Present.
For the Northborough K-8 school administration, we have Greg Martineau, Superintendent.
Present.
And we have Rebecca Pellegrino, Director of Finance.
Present.
And the members of the K-8 School Committee. I believe we have Keith LaBelle.
Present.
Lauren Bailey-Jones.
Present.
Joan Frank.
Present.
Kelly Gannett.
Present.
And I think we also have from the Regional School Committee, Kathleen Howland.
Present.
And have I missed anybody? I think I got everybody. No, let me not forget town staff. Town Administrator John Coder.
Present.
Town Finance Director Jason Little.
Present.
And now I think I have everybody.
Mr. Chairman. Mr.
Yes.
Chairman, I have a question. Because of Northborough, we have all members present. Does the chairman have to call us into session? That would be Keith LaBelle.
I think what we've determined for purposes of this meeting tonight, this is just an informational presentation, and there's no need for the other committees to formally convene and adjourn. So we're foregoing that for the moment. This is, I guess, being treated as essentially a selectmen's meeting with an informational presentation for all the assembled committee members.
Okay, thank you. It was just parliamentary rule. Thank you.
Yep. And so with that, we can proceed with the budget presentation. I will turn the presentation over to Town Administrator John Coder. John?
Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody being here tonight. We've got a lot of information, and a lot has transpired, particularly over the last month, not just with the health issue, COVID-19, the pandemic, but also in terms of the economic situation of the community and the rather strenuous work that's been done by everybody involved in terms of updating budgets and moving forward. So tonight, as the chairman said, we've got Board of Selectmen, Appropriations, Financial Planning, K-8 schools. Bear with me one second. There we go. So in terms of the agenda this evening, we're going to start with just a very brief summary of the events, essentially talk about how we got to where we are today, a quick recap on the FY 2021 budget process, a little bit about where we see us winding up and finishing fiscal 20, because that will certainly determine the starting point for the upcoming fiscal year. And then the meat of the discussion tonight is going to be talking about the revised revenue assumptions for fiscal 2020 that has impacted these revised budgets for K-8, Algonquin, Assabet, and the general government side of the budget. We'll talk about the overall general fund impact because there's a lot of pieces. There's all these individual budgets, but then there's the capital budget and also various warrant articles. These all come together on the town meeting warrant to put together the full package of the financial plan for the community in fiscal 20. And then last but not least, Jason touched upon it. We'll talk a little bit about the process moving forward. How do we get from this point to town meeting and amend these budgets and warrant articles at that venue? So first, in terms of just a little bit of background, and I'm not going to go through all this extensively, but I think it's important to hit upon the key things that have impacted this particular budget cycle. And I think the first thing I wanted to mention is very early on in March, when COVID-19 became an issue, the pandemic was hitting the news, the town of Northborough formed a COVID-19 task force. And that task force includes Board of Health, administration, public safety, finance, and also from the school department, we've had Greg Martineau and Mary Ellen Duggan, the wellness coordinator. And pretty much everything that we've done as a community from the onstart of this issue, we've done as a collaborative group. So all of the communications that went out, every action that we've taken has been basically done collectively by this group. And people have come in and out of it, depending upon the needs. We've had social service agencies coming in and out, but this task force has really been responsible for coordinating the town's overall response to COVID-19, not the budgetary aspects, but the emergency pandemic response. So as you all recall, on March 10th, the governor declared a state of emergency. Greg Martineau and the school committee closed the public schools on the 13th. The governor then closed all the schools the following Monday across the Commonwealth. On the 17th, we closed our municipal buildings, so town hall, library, senior center, all closed to the public, although they remained open for public service. And on March 23rd, we had a selectmen's meeting where the town meeting warrant was posted and voted to be posted, and the official fiscal 2021 budget hearing that's required under the town charter with the Appropriations Committee took place that night on a hybrid in-person and Zoom meeting. I'm going to come back and talk about the significance of that March 23rd meeting and why it took place when it did, and how we move forward off of that. Same meeting, the town declared a state of emergency, and then on the 24th, the governor closed all non-essential businesses. I think the 24th is when most people took notice that this is serious, and essentially the economy at that point was put into a medically induced coma, as folks have said. Most of us, including the town hall, we went to a modified work schedule. We closed the buildings, as I said, did a lot of remote work, same thing the school department. But again, throughout this whole thing, we have remained open for services for our community. Beginning of April, when we realized that this was going to continue and there was just an onslaught of information that was out there from the state, from the schools, from the town, from public health, resources, we put a comprehensive website together. And again, the task force worked together collaboratively to put this together. And it was a clearinghouse for all the information, all the resources that we put out there for our community. And that is still being updated on a regular, almost daily basis. And any piece of information, if you want to go back and look at what we did and when we did it, it's been up and through that website. Most recently, we closed and canceled our summer camps and our summer concert programs, unfortunately, another casualty of the pandemic. But we've sent out, and I don't want to go through a list of everything we've done, but we communicated through Code Red, which is our reverse 911 system. We communicated through Town News, our email blasts. The superintendent, through their system, has sent stuff out to all of the parents of the school-age children. And we've used all of our social media accounts as well as Northborough cable access television. So we've hit every venue that we possibly can to get information out. We've held public input sessions with regard to our response to COVID-19, and we've done some special events going through resources for community resources for potential populations in need. We did a whole separate meeting on resources for the business community. and we continue to communicate. The way it looks is that's not going to change anytime soon. So I go back, I mentioned the March 23rd meeting where we voted to close the warrant and to post or to hold the fiscal 21 budget hearing. At that point in time, we had no legal means to not proceed on on the schedule required by our town charter. But on April 3rd, the legislature passed a law that allowed us to extend or postpone town meeting and the election due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So on 4/13, the moderator, in consultation with the Board of Selectmen, postponed town meeting, and we postponed it on a temporary basis first to May 27th, knowing that we were going to have to do it again. We can only extend town meeting under the legislation in 30-day increments. So on the 18th, again, the moderator and the selectmen got together and we targeted June 22nd for town meeting. So as of today, that June 22nd is a date that we are legitimately trying to meet. Now, there's a lot of logistics that go into how we're going to be able to do town meeting. It will be at the high school in the auditorium, between the gym and the auditorium inside, and we're working towards that. So at this point in time, unlike the May date, the June 22nd date is something that we legitimately are going to strive towards. If for some reason that we cannot meet and have town meeting on June 22nd, we have to have a budget by the end of the fiscal year, which is June 30th. And so if we cannot get to town meeting and vote a budget, what we will need to do as a community is under another special act, we will have to vote a 1/12 budget, get it approved by the state, and move forward on a 1/12 basis. Now, even if we do that, even if we move forward on a 1/12 basis and we're unable to have town meeting, we need to have a budget upon which to base the 1/12. So everything that the school committees have done, the Board of Selectmen, the financial boards and committees, including the meeting this evening and the stuff that will take place over the next 2 weeks, all of this is necessary to bring to conclusion this process for updating and revising the fiscal 21 budget. So let's just stop for a second now and step back. In terms of the fiscal 21 budget process, I think it's important for people to know that the process starts in the fall of 2019. And just like we're doing tonight, we have all the boards and committees together this evening, and we do that at least once a year. And typically we do it in December, and that's when we review all of our financial data. We look back at trends, retro 10 years, trend analysis looking back, and then we forecast forward 5 years. And the point of the meeting in December is to get some basic consensus around the assumptions for developing the budget. So tonight, this is kind of a second pass at that, since the assumptions that we all agreed to through consensus back in December, that we were going to bring forward essentially level service budgets. Those assumptions, and clearly the revenue assumptions, are no longer valid. So we've had to revise our budgets. And so part of this evening is to show all of these boards and committees, all the policy boards and committees that are normally involved in that process in December, to update you on where things stand today and how all these individual budgets and pieces fit together. Following the December financial trend monitoring, January through March, actually January through April, the financial boards and committees review the capital articles as well as the budget. So we spent a long Saturday here with the school department and the Appropriations Committee reviewing all the budgets. They've sat and they've met with police, fire, DPW, and that's what they do. And it gets all the way through. We have the public hearing on March 23rd. And then after that, typically the Appropriations and the Board of Selectmen will vote their recommendations for town meeting. Because again, the school committee, Appropriations, Financial Planning, and the Board of Selectmen, one of your fundamental roles is to act as advisory policy boards to the members of town meeting, because they can't look at this data and this process in the detail that you either get to or have to, depending upon your perspective. So again, that March 23rd date was absolutely critical that we moved forward with those budgets and that level service budgets. And that was the culmination of a process that started back in the fall. Now, even though we held the hearing None of the boards and committees at that point approved or recommended necessarily those budgets, because we all knew, based on what was unfolding around COVID-19, we knew we were going to have to revisit these budgets over the coming months. And that's exactly what we have done. So in terms of that review process, just to remind folks, on April 13th, I made a presentation to the Board of Selectmen, giving an update on how we were seeing fiscal 20 close out. Because our fourth quarter for the fiscal year that we're in right now is when we saw revenues drop off, particularly and primarily revenues regarding hotel meals, permits, our local receipts. We have not seen for fiscal 20 a reduction or a drop off in our state aid or our local taxes. So we provided that information, and then we gave a little bit of an update on what we saw coming for fiscal 21. In that context, and with that information, the school committee and the superintendent went back to their departments and their staff to revise the budget. And we'll talk in a moment about the revenue assumptions that went into these revised budgets. But just in terms of timeline and continuity, the K-8 budget was presented, revised budget was presented to the school committee on May 14th. The general government, the non-school departments, I presented to the Board of Selectmen on May 18th. The regional high school budget and assessment was presented to the regional school committee on May 20th. And then most recently last week, the financial planning committee went back and revised the fiscal 21 capital budget. And that's going to be an important component we'll talk about in a moment, because essentially the financial planning committee, with the recommendation of staff, is postponing some of our planned capital investments for this upcoming town meeting to free up and create some liquidity for us in the upcoming budget. So I just want to cover a couple of things as we move and we talk about preparing for fiscal 21. The town of Northborough is in relatively good shape. And I say relatively because if you look at it on a personal level, if you compare two people, one person, both folks, unfortunately, say lose their job. One person has money reserves saved up, emergency cash, isn't living beyond their means, has low debt, isn't relying on one-time revenues to prop up their lifestyle. They're in their very different position than somebody else going into a financial crisis who has a lot of debt, is living beyond their means, doesn't have an emergency fund reserve, things of that nature. So the town of Northborough, going back through the policy boards and committees and our policies as well as our practices, we've done things to put us in the best possible shape and the best possible footing heading into this recession. I mentioned the financial trend monitoring report that we did back in December of 2019. Although some of the data has changed, we spent a great deal of time at that meeting talking about the recessionary headwinds that we saw coming. So everything that we did, even with the level service budget that we brought forward, we were still planning and anticipating a recession. Now, let's all be honest, nobody was anticipating a pandemic, and we certainly weren't anticipating a medically induced coma for our economy. This is something none of us have experienced in the past. So that's kind of where we are right now. But in terms of our strengths, right now we have, before we appropriate some of these reserves for our fiscal 21 budget, we have approximately 12% of our operating budget in reserves. It's a combination of free cash and just under $5 million in stabilization fund. Now, if you think about our reserves, think about in your personal life, you have your savings account and your checking account. So stabilization is our savings account and free cash is our checking account. So periodically you pay for things out of your checking account and you might move some of the money in your checking permanently into your savings account. That's what we do on an annual basis, typically at town meeting. But right now, before we move forward, we have got 12% in financial reserves. That puts us in good shape. This is the equivalent in your personal life of having 3 to 6 months of emergency funds in case something bad happens. We also don't rely on a lot of one-time revenues in the operating budget. It's less than 1%. So again, like in your personal life, if you're using a lot of one-time revenues to prop up your lifestyle, if things go bad, you have a structural deficit built into your operating expenses. So we have very little one-time revenue coming in. And that means in the case of fiscal 21, where we have an emergency or a very unexpected financial crisis, we can bring some additional one-time revenues in to help us out to smooth things over while we have time to plan for a more long-term approach. And that's what this allows us to do. So we have low, less than 1% on a structural basis in the operating budget. We also have very low debt, less than 4%. You know, the bond rating agencies want to see you less than 10%. 5 to 10% means you're investing in your buildings and your equipment. So we're at the low end of that. And we're at the low end by design because we're getting ready to do our next significant building project. If you remember, we brought the debt down before we move forward with the Lincoln Street building project, $25.5 million project. That debt service came back up and now it's dropped back down and we're getting ready to do the next big project, which would be the fire station. So the good news is we don't have a lot of debt that's a drag on our operating budget at the moment. And that's a good place to be. We also, because of conservative budgeting, we have not taxed to the max on the Prop 2.5. We have about $2.2 million in excess levy capacity. And so on an annual basis, we have not required overrides and we have not been taxing folks to the maximum of 2.5. In fact, you'll hear me say a little bit later in the revised fiscal 21 budget, not only are we not using any of this levy capacity, but we're not going to tax in fiscal 21 to the max of a typical basic Prop 2.5 increase. And again, conservative budgeting and trying to be very sensitive to the tax impact to the residents. This is a pro and con. The last one here, a low reliance on intergovernmental transfers. You hear me during the financial trend monitoring always talking about how state aid as a percentage of our budget has gone from about 13% down to 8%. And right now, as we look at our revised fiscal 21, it's going to drop down to about 6%. So the bad news is we're getting less money from the state. The good news is when the state cuts state aid, it doesn't hurt us as bad because we're not as reliant. Some of our neighboring communities receive 20% of their operating budget from state aid. Those communities right now are in very, very bad position because a cut in that state aid, like what we're anticipating for us, is devastating to their services. I mentioned capital. We're going to talk about our capital investments and our free cash policy. But essentially, we've been making regular investments in our schools, in our equipment. We've been putting roofs on buildings, replacing boilers, replacing cruisers and DPW trucks. And because we've been doing that at a time where we're entering a little bit of a fiscal crisis here, we have the ability to postpone some of those things on a short-term basis. And I can't stress enough, this isn't a long-term approach. No different than you in your personal life. If you've got a car and you were thinking about replacing it in the middle of a fiscal crisis or a pandemic, you might choose to hold on to that car for a year or two longer so that you can kind of weather if you're not sure what's going to happen with your employment or what might be happening with the economy in general. That's essentially what we're proposing to do here. But just like in your personal life, the need to replace that vehicle or to invest in the infrastructure and capital, it doesn't go away. But what gives us the ability to maneuver, to create flexibility, and to create a little bit of liquidity to handle some of these unexpected issues that we're dealing with right now. We also had the foresight when we added some additional revenues, particularly the hotel and meals tax, that we used those. We didn't funnel those revenues into hiring people and expanding services. We use those to take care of an unfunded liability, which is our other post-employment liability, essentially health insurance for retirees. So when the hotel and meals tax revenue dropped 80%, and that's what it's done, it's dropped 80%, what we're going to do moving into fiscal 21 is we're not going to be making a contribution to our OPEB trust fund. That's one of those quick maneuvers that we can make that frees up and doesn't impact the operating budgets immediately. Again, it's like if you lose your job in your personal life, you stop contributing to your retirement savings, right? It's not a long-term solution. At some point, you not only have to get back to contributing, but you actually have to increase and revisit your plan because you're going to need to make up for the lost time. But in the short term, that's a good move to make, again, to create a little bit of room for yourself. Our tax base is solid. It's not heavily reliant. You've been reading the papers. There's a number of communities on Route 9 that are heavily reliant on hotel and meal revenue, and they are slashing and cutting their budgets because those revenues are directly impacting their fiscal 21 budget. Most of the impact from the hotel and meals tax, the negative impact that I just mentioned, is basically requiring us, or is tied to this OPEB trust fund, which we're going to delay. And again, I just want to be clear, that was a policy decision by design, that those revenues didn't come in. We didn't hire teachers and police officers and firefighters on those revenues for this very reason, to protect ourselves against an unexpected sharp downturn in the economy. Again, we didn't anticipate a pandemic, but we did anticipate a recession because they come on a regular cycle. The last bullet here, we have a strong overlay account. This is where if people are applying for abatements, and this is something I want everybody to understand. When the private sector, when you start reading the papers and the private sector has financial difficulties, it does not typically impact us immediately. Usually there's a lag. So in this case, when we look at tax revenues for fiscal 21, it's based on values that were established in January of this year. As of January of this year, things were in pretty good shape. So when we look forward for fiscal 21, the fiscal year that we're moving into, we're not anticipating a tremendous amount of abatements because the values are all established as of really last year. This is going to come and be an issue for us in fiscal 2022. And the reason why I want everybody to be thinking about this is because there's going to be a lag of 12 to 18 months for when we start to feel a lot of the pain of the economy and the recession. And just on the other, just like the lag on the front end, we're going to see a lag on the backside. So when the private sector gets going, the economy opens up, and things start improving economically for the private sector, we are going to still feel a lag before our revenues come back and before state revenues come back. So people just need to anticipate that and understand that that's how it's going to happen. Now, here's the last bullet, and I want everybody to pay attention to this one closely because this is the silver bullet, or the magic bullet if there is one. Moving into fiscal 21, there is the federal coronavirus relief funds. They have been appropriated by Congress. They have been distributed to the states. And most importantly, they have actually been allocated to the individual communities in Massachusetts. Northborough's share of this $2.7 billion is $1.3 million. And if you saw my presentation to the Board of Selectmen on the 18th, you heard me refer to this as we're dragging on our hands or knees through the desert, dying of thirst, and there's an icy glass of water just out of reach. That's the $1.3 million of icy glass of water that I'm referring to. It is allocated and sitting in a dedicated account for the town of Northborough. We cannot access those funds right now. Those funds, under the rules that were passed with the appropriation from the federal government, can only be used for direct COVID-19 expenses, protective gear, overtime, municipal responses to dealing with the pandemic. What do we want that money for, guys? What's the most important thing? It's revenue replacement. We need revenue replacement for lost state and local receipts. At the state level, what they need more than anything as well is revenue replacement. So what's holding everything up right now is the state cannot use that money for revenue replacement, which is why sitting here today, we're about ready to start fiscal 21. It's the same fiscal year for the state as it is for us. We have zero, not a little, not a maybe, we have zero knowledge about what our state aid is going to be in fiscal 21. How do you prepare a budget with no information about your second highest revenue source? Well, the state is going to punt. If I'm a betting man, I'd say they're going to move the 1/12 budgets until they get clarification from the federal government that this $2.7 billion can be used for revenue replacement. So here's a couple of things that's going on right now. So this is an article that appeared in the Metro West Daily on the 31st of May. And the article, I know you can't read it, but I'm just using it as a visual aid. The article talks about the situation. It talks about the last recession that we had, where the federal government provided stimulus funds, and the state then took those stimulus funds and they used them to backfill the cuts in state aid that we were going to face. The state wants to do this. We want them to do this, but right now under the rules, they can't. So there's two things that's happening right now that everybody needs to be aware of. There's the coronavirus relief funds, the $2.7 billion that's already appropriated to Massachusetts. And then there's another $3 trillion package that was passed by the House that specifically includes revenue replacement funding for states and municipalities. We were hopeful that this was going to make its way through Congress before Memorial Day, but the Senate declined to take it up. Now, the Senate has said that they are open to additional aid packages, and specifically aid packages for states and municipalities, but they weren't prepared to do it just yet. There's some political wrangling that's going to occur. So this is what I want you to keep in mind. There's the $1.3 million in an account right now dedicated Northborough. Either we're asking the Congress either to change the rules and make that funding available to us in fiscal 21, or appropriate additional funding that is allowed to be used for revenue replacement. One or two of these things is going to take place. We don't know when, and we don't know to what extent, particularly if they decide to take this money back if it's not used, if it's not used for direct expenses, the $1.3 million, and make a separate appropriation. We don't know what that separate appropriation will be. We don't, more importantly, know how the state will filter it down to the town of Northborough. So right now, that 1.3 million is being distributed by population. That's how you want it distributed. If they funnel it through the Chapter 70 formula and the cherry sheets, we will see a very small percentage of that relative to other communities. Just like our state aid is a very small piece based on our socioeconomic demographics. If it filters through, we're going to see a small piece of that. But this is the silver bullet. This is going to be available at some point between now and the fall. We just don't know when. So now I'm going to shift gears. Let's talk about the revenue assumptions, because right now we're building this budget, and we have built this budget based on the assumption that we're going to lose state aid, local receipts, and no silver bullets coming to backfill those for us. What I have up on the screen right now are the original assumptions that we talked about back in December of 19, upon which the school committee, K-8, and the high school and the general government built a level service budget. Okay, so 4.7% increase in taxes, including we were going to, under that level service budget, we were going to dip into our excess levy capacity. We're going to do a Prop 2.5 increase, and we were going to use 124,000 of that levy capacity I spoke about earlier in order to support that level service budget. Local receipts, the hotel meals tax permit, we were thinking was going to be level funded. We're always very conservative on that revenue source. We assume, based on the governor's budget, we're going to get just shy of a 1% increase in state aid. And then in terms of one-time revenues and free cash in the operating budget, our policy limits it, as I said before, to 1%. The next slide is going to show you the revised revenue assumptions upon which the budgets that have been reviewed and presented to the various boards and committees were based upon. Very different. Under taxes, we're now down to a 3.58% increase. We're still confident in our new growth figures because that stuff is permitted and it's in the ground, but we have eliminated using any excess levy capacity, and probably more importantly, we have reduced the tax increase to below a regular basic Prop 2.5 increase. So if these budgets are approved, we'll actually add levy capacity. It'll go from about $2.2 million of excess levy capacity to $2.4 million. Okay. And again, why is this being done? Well, to use that levy capacity, unlike state aid or local receipts that are revenues that come in, in order to access levy capacity, really it just means you're raising taxes, you're increasing the tax impact. And given the economic times, we want to be very sensitive to what the businesses are going through and what the residents are going through. So we're trying to put together a budget across the board that maintains core services and personnel, but is also appropriately sensitive to the tax impact. Now, the second bullet, local receipts. Again, this is motor vehicle excise, hotel, meals, building permits, things of that nature. Right now, we're assuming a 14% reduction. Motor vehicle, we assume is going to drop by 11%. We'll talk about how we came to these numbers. And the hotel, the hotel and meals tax is reduced by 80%. So a lot of this is being informed by what happened in the fourth quarter of fiscal 20, as well as all the historic data that we reviewed, that we talk about during the financial trend monitoring presentation. But we go back and look at what happened through the last 3 recessions. And so how does this play forward for what we're looking at in fiscal 21? The big hit we're taking, state aid. Mass taxpayers back in April 4th assumed and forecast a 14% reduction in state aid. In state revenues. Now, that was assuming that the economy was going to be shut down and open back up and things were going to get on track quickly. On May 14th, they revised their forecast to say that the state revenues are going to drop up to 19%. And that's because a lot of the assumptions about how fast things were going to open back up have been dialed back. And I think we're seeing that across the board, that we're not back to work, that things aren't open. And when they do open, the new normal is going to be very different. And that new normal is going to impact hotel, meals, motor vehicle excise moving forward. So the town is assuming a 17% budget reduction, which is a $1 million reduction for fiscal 2021. The other thing that we've done, as I said, we're dipping into some of our reserves. We have postponed some capital, and normally we use $500,000 in the operating budget. We are now increasing that to $878,000 in the operating budget. And the reason for that, or the rationale for that, is we've taken some of the health insurance increases and the pension increases that impact all municipal employees, including the K-8 schools. So K-8 schools is actually responsible for 70% of the health insurance costs that are carried in the general government side of the budget. Those had to be taken out and dealt with. Otherwise, in order for us to on the general government side to come down, we would have been laying off a dozen people, and that didn't make sense for us. So let me talk now about state aid. So you have seen this. Graph many times over the years, and this is a 30-year history of state aid, and this isn't statewide. This isn't state aid across all municipalities. This is state aid specific to the town of Northborough, and you can see the recessionary periods that are highlighted by the 2 pointed-ended arrows through these dips and valleys. Now, if those of you that have been paying attention to the state and paying attention to all the economists, and it's alphabet soup, right? They talk about a V recovery, a U recovery, a W recovery. This is what they're talking about. Now, this isn't the whole economy. This is state aid, but this is how state aid is going to come and affect us very similarly. So you see these drops down and then the recovery. And by the way, this graph, as I point out every time, these are nominal dollars, meaning they're not adjusted for inflation. And I think everybody knows that, if you come over to fiscal 17, the same, $5 million in fiscal 17 is not the same as $5 million back in 2008. And I think we all understand that. But if you look at these profiles, the first recession down here was more of a U. The second one looked more like a V. And the last one I refer to as a check mark, where it kind of dropped down quickly, but the recovery was slow. So when you start listening to what the economists are saying and what the mass taxpayers are saying about this last recession, we're looking now, they've sort of given up on the V, the sharp down and back up, that everything in the economy is going to open back up and everything is going to be great. What you're hearing now is, and people are focusing more on, is more like a check mark. We're seeing this sharp drop, but the fundamental changes that are going to happen to people's behavior, are they going to be willing to go back to theaters? Are they going to go back out to eat? Are they going to start spending money again? The whole entertainment industry, as you know from watching the news, is in a crisis and struggling with how are they going to get back to normal, or what is the new normal. So this profile that we have and that you saw in the last recession of a check mark, we're more than likely looking at something like that. So what does that mean for Northborough? It means we need to deal with and manage this decline here, this sharp decline, to get to the bottom of this trough, and then understand that it's going to be a long climb to get back out. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal earlier in the week where economists were making the argument that it could take up to the recovery to get back to where we were could take up to 10 years. Now, obviously, if the economists knew what was really going to happen, they wouldn't be economists. They'd be retired on the beach somewhere. So they're just looking at the data and trying to create these econometric models to show where we might wind up. But here's what I want you to look at now, guys. Look at this last data point on this graph for fiscal 21, that last bar graph. That's what a 17% reduction in state aid looks like in fiscal 21. Now, I mentioned before, why did we pick 17%? Well, number one, it's within the range, dead smack in the middle of the range, that the mass taxpayers and all the economists that came in to advise the legislature about what the revenues might look like, we're dead smack in the middle of it. More importantly, it's not just what's happening with state aid across the state. We're looking at this data, and this is what I hope you appreciate tonight. This is specific to Northborough. This isn't what state aid's doing across the Commonwealth. And if you go back in 03, 04, we lost 17% of our state aid in one year. That was a very, very difficult time period for the town of Northborough. And I started working for the town in fiscal 03. So I came right in the middle of that. Now, if you look at the more recent recession and you see how let me see if I can get a little pointer so that we can see what okay. So if you look at this recession, this was the last one, right? That first drop would have been more significant, but what plugged that hole? See, this is where if we were all in a room together and I could see, I'd pick on somebody and ask them, what plugged that hole? Stimulus
Northborough
funds.
Crossing.
The federal government provided stimulus funding to the state, and the state didn't cut our local aid as much because they used the federal funds to backfill it. So we had a little bit of a softer landing coming down, then we bottom out, and then things was a very long, slow climb to get back. Okay, here, this is our drop. We hope, and to some extent, we plan for the worst and we're hoping for the best. The hoping for the best is that somewhere in around here, we might see some federal funds that soften this drop so that we don't see this again. We see something that looks more like this. It's a little bit more manageable for us, okay? But sitting here today, we have to produce a balanced budget. And so sitting here today, we're assuming that 17% drop. Let me go now to local receipts. So this is our local receipts. This is motor vehicle excise, hotel, meals, permits. You see this stuff bouncing up and down, up and down. We're very conservative on these because they tend to be impacted by whatever's happening in the larger economy. And so when we build our budget, as I said, we start our budget, we do our forecast back in December. We're 6 to 12 months away from the next fiscal year. And so if the economy moves into a recession, we're very vulnerable. So we tend to be conservative on our local estimates. And again, this is specific data. You should be very interested in this. If you're on any board or committee in Northborough, you should be absolutely focused on what I'm saying next. This drop right here, this is the fiscal 21 drop. This is 14%. This is what we're assuming. This drop here is because fiscal 20 is what we budgeted, not the actual. Everything backwards from fiscal 19 on, that's actual. This is what we budgeted. We could have budgeted up here, but we didn't, because we were talking about potential headwinds coming, recessionary headwinds. We wanted to be conservative. So we level funded for planning purposes back in December what we thought we were going to get for local receipts. And by the way, this big spike here is because we experienced the last big push of economic development in Northborough. All the large industrial buildings that you're seeing being built out on Bartlett Street, those building permits came in $400,000 above what we were budgeting or planning for. So we were already conservative. And the reason why this is absolutely critical is because we were conservative and this was our base budget, we're assuming a 14% reduction off of that, based again on historic data and what we have seen for lost revenues. Now, why is this critical for us? And why, when you read the newspaper, do you see some communities saying, my goodness, we're looking at a 30% drop in local receipts? The reason we aren't is because we were conservative on the front end. We budgeted a level amount of local receipts for fiscal 21 when we were originally putting our budget together for this very reason. So when you talk about local receipts, the biggest part, let me just come back. So local receipts somewhere, just shy around just shy of $4 million. The biggest chunk of that, almost up here, 2.5% of local receipts is motor vehicle excise. That's where the lion's share of that revenue source comes from. And as you hear me say all the time, when the economy starts to get soft, right? When things go bad, what's the first thing people do? You hold on to that car. You don't buy a new car. These receipts are very sensitive. And so look, these are the last recessionary periods. That's a 10-11% drop. That's a 10% drop. Over these 2 years, it's a 6 and a 5% drop. So 11% drop. So what am I forecasting for us this year? 11% drop in motor vehicle excise. It's important that people see these assumptions and they understand and agree that there's a rationale behind them and why we're not either being more rosy with these predictions or these forecasts, or we're not being more pessimistic with them. We're being spot on, in my opinion, realistic with them. So I guess let me stop here for a second. And I had discussed this with the chairman. Before I move into the expenditure side of things, I can stop for a moment if people would like to, if there are questions about the revenue assumptions at this point in time. This is my attempt to keep you from glazing over from all of this information and engage my audience a little bit, because this is a lot of information to take in, and I understand that. So, if we can, through the chair, I'll pause for a moment and entertain questions that people may have with regard to the revenue or anything I've covered so far.
Thank you, John. If I could ask you, John, to stop sharing momentarily. I can see everyone in view. Let me begin with members of the Board of Selectmen. Do you have any questions? If so, please raise your hand. I do not see any raised hands.
Okay.
So I'll move to,
That's good.
I'm sorry. Good. I'll move to the Appropriations Committee. Appropriations Committee members. I do not see any raised hands. On to the Financial Planning Committee. Anyone? John Rappa, go ahead, proceed.
How do your revenue projections comparable towns?
I'm sorry, John, can you repeat that question, please?
How do your revised revenue projections compare against comparable towns?
Oh, I love that. I love that question. What's a comparable town? Number one, and their budgeting practices are very different. So remember, I just talked a little bit about the local receipts. So if we weren't conservative, there are neighboring communities that cannot afford to be conservative on their local receipts. So they've pushed, when they built their initial budgets, like we did back in December, and said we're going to do a level service budget, they pushed those local receipts up as high as they could based on the prior year. We didn't, we held them. So another community could be suffering or look like they have much more significant cuts than us, even though they're a comparable community to us. Now, on the other side, I talked about how we manage ourselves through fiscal policies and by making intelligent decisions about making ourselves recession resistant, protecting ourselves and having the ability to maneuver in the short term when everything is going chaotically in the larger economy. So in that example, I would talk about the use of the hotel and meals tax. We made a conscious decision not to, when we exercised in the last recession, those are local option taxes. So we approved those local option taxes, but we didn't want to bring them in and hire teachers, police, and fire because we know those are the most sensitive revenues that are out there for a recession. And like I said, you build your budget 6 to 12 months before you actually reap the results of it. And so there are a lot of communities that adopted the hotel and meals tax, and they funded police, fire, DPW, teachers, and basic services. Now those revenues are down 80%. They have to cut or find some other way to fund those positions. We use those revenues to start dealing with our unfunded liabilities, which is in our long-term best interest. It's kind of like you come up with some additional money in your personal life, and instead of expanding your standard of living, you take that new revenue and you put it in your retirement fund. In the long term, you're better off. So that's what we've done. So all these things that we've done along the way through the policies and practices over the last 10 years, taking all the lessons we learned from the last recession, have put us in better shape. So you can look at a comparable community who is going to suffer to a much greater degree in the short term than maybe the town of Northborough does. So it's not just are they a comparable community, but how have they managed themselves? And look, and let's be honest too, there are things that we had happen in Northborough. So you can have a comparable community that's the same size as us, has the same budget, the same population. And by most indicators, you'd say, hey, that's a comparable community. But did they have the economic growth that we had recently? When we had the growth that we had with the mall, we chose not to just blow up the budgets. We didn't let the school budgets expand incredibly. We didn't hire 8 more firefighters and 8 more police officers. And by the way, those were requests. We were disciplined, very disciplined financially, and we didn't do that. And what we did is we held the tax impact down. So residents had a very low tax impact, and we created excess levy capacity. And that's why we have $2.2 million in excess levy capacity. That's available to us. You can use that levy capacity, and you don't need a Prop 2.5 override. But again, that money isn't free. The only difference between using excess levy capacity and filing for a Proposition 2.5 override is, one, you can do with town meeting authorization. The other, you have to go to the voters at the ballot. And you'll see some of our neighboring communities are looking at overrides. So we have levy capacity, we're not dipping into it, and we are actually adding to it with the conservative budget that we've done. So it's a very complicated and much longer response. I'd say on the whole, we have our comparable communities. It depends on what you're comparing. If you want to compare our comparable community for fire service, you can have a town that's the same size as us, same population, but if they don't provide advanced life support, ambulance, paramedic level service, they're not a comparable community. So what we do is we do our comps based on specifically what we're trying to measure. And I will say, we compare very well. We compare very well. In terms, one thing I just want to circle back to, guys, because this is getting a lot of attention everywhere right now, and that is the tax impact. In March of 2014, the Boston Globe did an analysis of tax impact, tax increases for the prior 10 years of all the 52 Metro West communities. The town of Northborough was the lowest tax increase over that prior 10-year period. So moving from 2014 to present, we have had increases. We have done building projects, but our tax impact and our tax increases have been very comparable or lower than our comparable communities. And you know how we know this? Because on a relative basis, all the Department of Revenue compares they rank all the tax bills highest to lowest. We used to have the 53rd highest tax bill in the Commonwealth. We now have dropped down, or we had dropped down to 62nd or 63rd, where we have remained basically. And if we were doing something radically different, if our taxes were going up faster than our comparable or surrounding communities, we would see ourselves escalating, climbing up that list. And we haven't, and we're not. Now, are taxes increasing? Absolutely. Do you want to have a good school system? Do you want to have police and fire? Do you want to maintain your roads? All that stuff costs money. And if state aid is declining, as we already talked about, local receipts are slow, then there will be tax increases. That is what's happening everywhere. And again, neighboring communities and comparable communities are either have to make significant cuts in the budget or seek overrides from the voters in order to do what we're doing without having to do those extraordinary measures. You gotta be careful you ask a question, John. Listen, I love this stuff. I'm passionate about finance. I'm passionate about about data, but I'm also passionate about trying to communicate this very complex information that we're talking about tonight to the policy boards and committees and the voters at large, because it's easy to take something out of context and it's easy to look at what's happening in another community. But until you drill down to the data, you don't really know if you're comparing apples to apples. And 9 times out of 10, you're simply not.
Thanks, John.
All right.
Thanks, John.
After that, everybody's going to be afraid to ask a question because we're going to be here all night, right, guys?
I will remain on the Financial Planning Committee. If anyone else has a question, please raise your physical hand. Seeing none, I go to the school committee members. School committee members, do you have a question? Okay, I have 2. I'll first go to Keith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 1 request and 1 question, and I'm sure John can handle both. So
Oh, you got muted, Keith.
Yep, sorry, that's my mistake. Thank you. The request is just a bit more explanation around what a 1/12 basis budget is.
Yep.
And then the question
Lost you again, Keith.
is, yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I've got notes in a separate screen. The question is simply if the school district incurs expenses to purchase PPE, can that fall under the coronavirus relief fund?
Okay, 2 great questions. I'll try to be a little shorter in my answers this time around. The 1/12 budget, under the acts of 2020, the legislature, realizing that communities either couldn't put together a budget financially, and that's the case with some of our neighboring communities, a direct abutting community, they cannot put a budget together, a balanced budget without slashing and laying off lots of folks. Because of that, and also because of the fact that the state can't ask us, or it's difficult for them to ask municipalities to put a balanced budget together by June 30th when they themselves can't do that. So they passed this legislation to allow a 1/12 budget. Now, there's a process to do this. We actually already have drafted a 1/12 budget and are trying to kind of pass it unofficially to our Department of Revenue representative to make sure that it's what they're looking for. But essentially what you do is you take your proposed fiscal 21 budget, and just like it sounds, you pass 1/12, but it's not a straight 1/12 because not all your expenses are paid monthly. A perfect example is literally in month 1, we pay for all of the pension costs for the town and the non-teacher employees. We pay it on day 1 because we get a discount. We also pay our building and liability insurance all on month 1 because we get a discount, and our budgets are based on getting those discounts. Not only that, but on a monthly basis, you don't pay everything monthly, you might pay it quarterly, you might pay it a couple times a year, you could pay it all at once. And so basically what the Department of Revenue is interested in is what's your whole budget? And then historically, what do you pay in this particular month that we're talking about? So in the month of July, we would pay our pension costs, we would pay our building liability, and then we'd pay basically 1/12 of what that budget would look like. So under the legislation, that 1/12 budget would be approved by the Board of Selectmen. Now, having said that, the question a lot of towns are struggling with is, okay, so what's a 1/12 budget? One of the reasons why we have been working feverishly behind the scenes here for the last month and a half is because we need to have consensus about what this fiscal 21 budget is. And so, again, the school committee has already reviewed and accepted that, the regional school committee. I presented to the Board of Selectmen. Next week, the Appropriations Committee will hopefully vote to accept this 1/12 budget that we're talking about and discussing this evening. And that would be the exercise from month to month until such time as we hold a town meeting. So on June 15th, the Selectmen's meeting on June 15th, based on everything that we're doing here tonight and next week, we are going to bring a 1/12 budget based on all of this information to the Board of Selectmen for approval as a layup in case for some reason we are unable to hold town meeting and approve our budgets, or we hold town meeting, we're unable to get a quorum to actually approve our budget. So that's our backup plan. If anybody who knows me, I wear belt, suspenders, and then I keep a piece of rope in my pocket too. So we're doing both those things so that no matter what, we need to make sure that the schools can continue to function, that police, fire, DPW can continue to function. Okay. That's the process for the 1/12 budget. And it'll be based on the budget that hopefully we are presenting and compiling tonight. Okay, can someone remind me, Keith, now, the second question was?
Yes, just whether if the school district purchases PPE, if that
yes.
can fall under the coronavirus relief fund.
So that's a great question. So we have $1.3 million. Right now that we have the general government side, I believe we have somewhere south of $100,000 of expenses that we could submit for. Under the conference calls that I've been participating in, the Department of Revenue and Administration and Finance at the state level is telling us not to include the school's expenses in that submission because there are coronavirus funding available to the schools. Having said that, if for some reason it's not viable, those other funding sources, we then would work with the schools and I would work with the superintendent and we would make sure you guys get taken care of. Make sense?
Yes, thank you.
So, and by the way, when we talk about this, it's more complicated. Every time we drill down a little bit, there's the coronavirus relief funds, the 1.3 million, and then there's the FEMA potential reimbursement because of the state of emergency. So we're actually, what the town is actually doing is we are submitting our expenses to FEMA for 75% reimbursement. And the other 25%, our matching 25%, we're submitting to the coronavirus relief fund. So we will get 100% and we'll minimize the amount of that 1.3 million that we're using so that we then hopefully can use it for revenue replacement. And we just, about a week and a half, or maybe about a week and a half or so, 2 weeks ago, we got clarification that we could actually use the coronavirus relief funds as the town's 25% match for the FEMA emergency funds. Just again, I know you guys don't, on the school side, don't live this, the Board of Selectmen, Appropriations, they're very familiar with this, but if there's an emergency, ice storm, think ice storm, right? And we have these blizzard and there's extraordinary expenses. If a state of emergency is declared, we submit our expenses to FEMA and we generally get 75% reimbursement. Sometimes the state makes up the other 25%, sometimes they don't. So because of the state emergency, that's what we're doing. On top of that, you have the coronavirus relief funds. And part of the coronavirus relief funds, there are specific pockets of money available to the school department. And finance administration at the state level is telling us, let them have the schools go there first. And if for some reason they can't get reimbursed there, then you can bring them in under your coronavirus release. I'll just say this, cooperation with your superintendent, our superintendent, Greg Martineau, has been phenomenal. I could not ask for a better partner to go through an emergency crisis with. Every bit of information that I'm talking about tonight, we talk about 2, 3, 4 times a week. I talk to him more often than probably my wife at this point. So that communication will continue through. And these funds don't expire, by the way, on June 30th, these coronavirus relief funds. They're there. So if we don't submit, we can submit for additional expenses up to December of 2020 under those funds. Okay?
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
I think there
John.
was one other question.
I was going to say, Lauren, I think you had indicated you want a question. Why don't you go ahead?
Yes, thank you so much. Because the amended FY21 budget is not paying into OPEB, what are the consequences for the next few budget cycles?
A great question. Again, I'll use the analogy of you in your personal life. If you were to lose your job, the first thing you would do is you'd stop contributing to your retirement, right? That's sort of your long-term investment. This is similar to that. What it means is when you get back to work and things get back to normal, whatever that normal looks like, you then revisit your funding plan for your retirement. We would revisit our funding plan for OPEB, and we're going to probably have to increase future contributions to make up time for that. So again, these are things that you can postpone in an emergency or in a dire situation for a year or two. But just so everybody's clear, you know, the risk that we run, that we collectively as a policy group, the risk that you run with uninformed people, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but people that just haven't spent any time on a financial board or committee, don't understand the gory details of this. I've got Dawn Rand. Dawn Rand has served on a financial board or committee to the Board of Selectmen since she was 19, okay? Jason Perot has been my financial planning chairman for 10 years before he moved to the Selectmen. I can go down the list. People have served, and Leslie, and they've served on these boards and committees for 10, 15, 20 plus years. They understand all of this this information and this perspective. Jesus, I'm rambling along and I lost my train of thought there. Your question again, repeat your question again, please.
So it was about OPEB and
Yes.
the consequences. And I
Thank
do
you.
have a follow-up question to sort of clarify. So
Okay.
because it's generally funded through the hotel and meal taxes,
Yeah.
in future years, because we sort of have to make up for our next budget cycle, would we look into other ways to secure those funds?
Sure. So okay, so let me come back. I apologize. I lost my train of thought there. When things get back on track, we need to be disciplined enough that when those revenues come back on the hotel and meals, that we don't get tempted to load them into the operating budget to expand the budgets and get things back faster. We need, just like when you get back to work in your personal life, you need to be disciplined to start putting money back into your emergency reserve fund if you tapped into that, to your retirement, and start taking care and tune up your car and take care of all your stuff. We're going to have to do the same thing. So we'll need to look at those things moving forward. I don't have an answer for you right now. It's an excellent question. But I guess where I was going originally was, we have to be careful as policy boards and committees that when we make this look easy, like, okay, we lost $550,000 in revenue, no problem. We'll just stop contributing to OPEB, and nobody feels any pain from that. No services are reduced, no teachers are cut, no police, no fire. You need to make sure that when you're talking to the public, that they understand that that's not a long-term viable solution to what we're doing. And that's where I was going with the discipline and the experience of the people on the boards and committees. In a lot of towns, that it's tempting. So when revenues start to come back, we want to be very disciplined. You want to start putting money back into your emergency account. You want to start restoring some of the services that were cut in a priority order, but you also need to start contributing back to that. And look, just so that we're being completely upfront and honest with each other, $550,000 was not a full funding plan. Okay, it was a step in the right direction. We should be putting aside about $1.2, $1.3 million a year if we were going to be really funding our OPEB on a full funding plan to 2035 or something like that. But just like your personal retirement, what is your financial advisor? Where's Mike Hodge? What would Mike Hodge tell you to do? He'd say, listen, if you can't afford to save the amount you should for retirement, save what you can. And so the 550 is what we can. Unfortunately, we dialed it back, but we do need to get back to it. I'm counting on you as a school committee member to be disciplined when we meet in December, when we talk about our financial trends, to be disciplined with me and the Board of Selectmen and the financial boards and committees to know we need to put money back there. We can't just, when those revenues come back, load it back in and start expanding services. That's very, very important. That's why we have all the policies, and that's why we have that discipline.
Thank you.
Those are great questions from school committee members. Look, I'm glad you guys are here. I talk this stuff day in and day out with the Board of Selectmen, Appropriations, and Financial Planning. I love that you're here. I appreciate that you're here. And I most appreciate that you're asking very intelligent, important questions. Thank you.
Anybody else on school committee with a question? Seeing none. Any staff members or superintendent who needs to ask a question? Seeing none. Anybody else for one last chance to ask a question before we proceed with the presentation? And once again, seeing none. So John, why don't you go ahead and proceed with the next segment?
Now that I checked in, because I can't see everybody when I go into presentation mode, now I know everybody's back awake, and we'll get back into it. Let me see if I can find the version that I was using. Here we go. All right, so just to reorient everybody, bear with me one second. Sometimes there's a little bit of a lag here. It won't let me advance the slide. Just bear with me one second. Looking for tech support. Why won't my slide advance? Don't you love Zoom meetings? Listen, when I do presentations, I'm prepared to the hilt, and it frustrates the heck out of me when these little glitches happen. Yep.
Try your arrow keys.
That's what I'm pressing, Chief.
Okay, hang on. Slideshow. Well, I would close out the slideshow mode and then go back into it, John.
All right.
You realize I'm just a fire chief and have no clue what I'm talking about, but I'm trying.
Yeah, I know, but you're sitting next to my IT director, so give him a poke. You know, I'm going to go back and open up. I'm going to go back and open up a new one. Oh. There we go, guys. We're back. Good news. All right. So just to remind folks, we left off. We were talking about these revenues, local receipts, motor vehicle. Now I want to talk about capital and how capital plays into our operating budget for fiscal year. Again, I know we've got some new committee members. I just want to remind people, when I use terms, I talk about the capital improvement program versus the capital budget. The plan is a 6-year plan that has all of our capital, our buildings, our equipment, our infrastructure that we're going to be investing in over the next 6 years. The capital budget are the projects that were planned to go forward for fiscal 2021. So if you look at the town meeting warrant that's on the website, you'll see a whole bunch of individual warrant articles for trucks, for equipment, for buildings. That's the capital budget. So when I say capital budget, it's a collection of articles. So what you have on your screen right now is the original capital budget. So with us tonight, we have the Financial Planning Committee. They're the committee responsible for working with me to put together the capital budget. On February 18th, they approved the capital budget that was included in the warrant, okay? So on the left-hand side, you can see the projects. Let me see if I can get my little spotlight thing to work for you again. Okay. So over here you have, well, slide. All right, I lost the ability to advance my slide again, Chief.
John, when you turn on the little pointer, you're going to lose the ability to move the slide.
Well, thank you. See how I need the superintendent to help me out here? All right, so I turned it off. Now it still won't let me advance the slide. I apologize, guys. This frustrates the heck out of me. Okay. All right. So let's go back. So on the left-hand side, I'm just going to use my arrow key because that seems to be interfering. So we were going to replace 2 cruisers for $98,000. We had a feasibility study for town hall, some DPW equipment, some garage. We're working on doing the tank rehabilitation. And we had $100,000 for improvements to the Melican Middle School parking lot and handicapped accessibility. So overall, the capital budget, so the collection of all these articles that we were going to town meeting with was $3.64 million. And what I want you to look at here is this column right next to it, this free cash. These are the one-time revenues that we, instead of putting in the operating budget, we use to pay for this capital. And the reason why that's so critical is when you come, it's just, again, your personal life, you get a little windfall, you get some one-time money. If you use it to inflate your standard of living, you're going to have trouble next year. But instead, if you use it to put a furnace in, to buy a new washer and dryer, that's a good use of those monies. And so we use our one-time revenues, our budget surplus when we close out the year, to buy our capital, because that does not create drag on our operating budget. So it doesn't add debt in the future. Again, I always say it's the difference between paying cash for a washer and dryer or charging it on your credit card and then having to pay the credit card off over a period of time out of your operating budget. But if you look, $1.47 million is what we were going to use in free cash for fiscal 21. Last week on the 27th, the Financial Planning Committee met and they revised the capital budget. And so now you see we're only buying 1 cruiser. We've eliminated the loader, some trucks, and now we're going to spend $712,000 roughly on the capital budget instead of 1.47. And this is really important, guys, because part of our plans, our policies have put us in this position, and our plans are when something bad happens and a recession hits, because we have consistently put roofs on our schools, and we have replaced boilers in our schools, and we have replaced DPW trucks and police cruisers and taking care of our roads. When something bad happens, we can hit the pause button on some of these projects, create some liquidity, and help us out through this next budget cycle. So that's exactly what we've done. So we have postponed these, and we're comfortable postponing these for a year or 2 if we had to. These won't create a crisis for us, but again, I can't stress enough, these are not permanent long-term solutions to budget shortfalls. We need to ultimately get ourselves on track and match up our operating budget with our recurring revenues. But in a crisis, things are dropping. Hopefully we patch it short-term and those revenues will start to return. The economy is opening back up. So hotel, meals, restaurant revenues, they are going to start to return. They will come back. State revenues will come back. And then you have the ability to maneuver. So let me show you how this is going to work. So every year under the free cash plan, I have to put a plan together for how we're going to use it. So when we close out fiscal 19, we had $2.85 million in free cash. We're going to use 175 for the Appropriation Committee's emergency reserve account. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that, the K-8 school committee members should know what that is, because when you open the school year, last year we had mold, unexpected, right? we use that emergency funds, the Appropriations Committee use that to take care of your mold problem. In other years, we use it to deal with snow and ice overdrafts, blizzards, things of that nature. So we always have that. $500,000 in the operating budget, and then we usually put from the checking account, from free cash into the savings account, stabilization, we usually put a little bit of money, $200,000. And the reason for that is we want to maintain our ratios. As our budget goes up, we want to make sure that our emergency reserve account stays at a comparable rate of between 8 and 9%. And then we typically would have this to spend on capital. So that was the original capital plan, right? About $1.47 million roughly that was available. Now look down at the bottom, the revised capital plan. You can see that the capital project requests went from the 1.47 to 712 for the reasons we just discussed. We also have eliminated contributing to the stabilization fund. We're not going to transfer the money from our checking account into our savings account because we're going to leave it into our checking account because we might need it. And what we did is we moved that 200,000 up into the Appropriation Committee reserve account, which is normally 175. Now it's 375. Why did we do that? Well, if things are bad, if the schools wind up having to lay folks off, reduce staff, and if the town has to lay folks off, reduce staff, or furlough people temporarily, we pay 1 for 1. We don't pay unemployment insurance. We pay 1 for 1. So this is where we would charge those one-time unemployment costs to. And if something else happens during the year, unexpected with a pandemic, and I don't know, the world is becoming a very uncertain place right now. We want to have a little bit more of our budgeted emergency funds. By the way, those funds are available to us during the fiscal year. Unlike stabilization, if you want to access your savings account, you have to hold a town meeting and they have to agree to appropriate it. The appropriated reserve account, when you found out you had mold, you can use that, and that's how you take care of it. You have a storm, use that and you take care of it. And then you can see here, the operating budget, instead of 500,000, because we reduced the capital, now we've increased our one-time revenue in fiscal 21 to $878,000. Now, here's the magic of these numbers, guys. This is important, so look at this carefully. After the spending plan, we still have $888,000 sitting in the free cash, the checking account, so to speak. Why is that a magic number? Well, if we're loading $878,000 of one-time revenue into the operating budget for fiscal 21, sitting here today, I want to make sure that we have the same amount to load into fiscal 22, so then we don't have a structural deficit that we need to cut $878,000 next year, okay? That's the discipline, because the questions you're going to get is, oh, why aren't you using more of that money to not cut budgets? Or why aren't you using more of that money to reduce the tax impact? We need to make sure that when we dip into the savings account, we do it in a disciplined fashion. So when we approach fiscal 21, we're cutting our budgets back. So again, I'll use the analogy of your personal life. You lose your job, right? You stop putting money into retirement. You cut back on your operating expenses, right? Maybe you cut cable, you stop going out to eat or those types of things. So you scale back reasonably on your operating budget. And then you dip into your savings account to make sure that you're paying your mortgage and your car payments and the things that absolutely have to be taken care of. On a macro level, that's what this fiscal plan that we're doing tonight does for the town of Northborough. We scaled back our budgets. We're dipping a little bit into our financial reserves, and we are doing it in a disciplined way that we're not going to create or kick the can so we just have a massive issue this time next year. So I like this graph. This is our revenues. It just kind of shows you how things move from the original. And by original, I'm talking about the level service budget that we presented on March 23rd. And now the revised is the budget that we're talking about tonight. So look at state aid, which has been declining from 13% of our operating budget revenues to 8%. Look what it does now, 6.8%. That's just where we are, guys. Now, free cash, although we're increasing the amount of free cash that we're using in the operating budget, why is it going down over here? It's going down because we're also eliminating, we're not spending all that free cash on the capital budget that we just discussed. So that's why free cash is dropping down a little bit. Local receipts are down. Other funds, revolving funds are down. But here's what's going to happen. And this is just a fact of the way things are going to go, is as those other revenue sources shrink, taxes on a relative basis, even though taxes are actually, we're not even taxing to the max of Prop 2.5 in this revised budget, okay? Taxes are not out of control by any means or measure. As a percentage of the operating budget, they're bigger because the other revenue sources are shrinking. So let's shift now and talk about the key operating budgets. So originally the Northborough K-8 budget, was scheduled under a level service budget back in March of 23rd, which we discussed last year, was going to go up 3.1%. That has been scaled back to 1%. The general government, my side of the budget, the non-school departments, was originally under the level service budget going to go up 3.5%. And remember, we have all the benefit costs for the K-8 schools, all the health insurance and the pension costs for your non-teaching on our side of a budget. So that's why our side was going up a little bit more. We have scaled that back to 1%. So just under our revenue sharing model that we talk about in December with the schools, we try to, on a relative basis, we look at what we have for revenues, and the school budgets and the general government side goes up a comparable amount. We have had to take the health insurance and the Worcester Regional Retirement out. That's what we're funding with the free cash, so that we don't have to go back and reduce the K-8 budget and the general government budgets further. Okay, so that's how we're kind of creating a little bit of relief for ourselves in this fiscal 21 budget. Assabet Valley is going up right now 20% because our enrollment's going up. It is what it is. Their overall budget was a 4%, a 4.15. They've reduced it to a 2.17, but our assessment isn't likely to budge. They're a relatively smaller part of our overall financial plan. On the other hand, Algonquin Regional High School is a significant budget issue for, not a budget issue, but a piece of our budget. And if you remember back in December 2019, when we set the table for our fiscal 21 budget, we spent a great deal of time talking about the shifting enrollments and the impact of the high school assessment on the overall tax impact. And so originally the high school budget was scheduled to go up 3.31%, and our assessment was going to go up 4.36%. You see now the assessment, the budget is down to a little over 2%, and the assessment is down to 2.31%. These are the scaled back budgets that we just talked about. I'll have a couple more slides, guys. Hang in there. We're just about done. So in terms, trying to bring all this together for you, how all these bits and pieces, what the school committee does and the financial planning committee does, and the selectmen and appropriations. So for the fiscal 21 budget, the big pieces that are in motion and what we've done is we have reduced the capital budget to create additional free cash capacity to increase the resources in the fiscal 21 budget from 500,000 to 878. Okay, less capital projects, a little more liquidity in our checking account, and we're putting some of it in to help us deal with these budget busters during this financial crisis. We've stopped contributing to OPEB in fiscal 21. That's just the decision we made to get us through this upcoming budget. We will, to Lauren's excellent point, have to revisit that. We did not contribute to stabilization. We don't need to put money in stabilization this year because our budget has been reduced so much that on a relative basis, our reserves have actually gone up a tiny bit because our budgets have been scaled back so significantly. Last but not least, the Appropriations Committee Reserve Fund, we're proposing that $200,000 in free cash be added to that account to, again, give us a little bit more cushion should something else unexpected happen in the upcoming fiscal year. And by the way, the money that goes into the Appropriations Committee Reserve account, if we don't use it, it comes from free cash, budget surplus. If we don't use it, it goes right back to free cash. Perfect example is in fiscal 20, the year that we're closing right now, we had a mild winter. We didn't have any mold in the schools. We didn't have any unexpected emergency other than the pandemic. So the 170, other than that, exactly. So the 175 that's sitting in the reserve account right now is unspent. It will close out when we close out fiscal 20. It will close out to free cash. So if we put that in the operating budgets, there'd be a temptation to spend it. It would grow and multiply. That's why you do it this way. So here's the big picture, guys. And you saw this in the memo I sent you in anticipation of this meeting. This was the original proposal. The general fund budget was going up 4.25%. Across all funds, the increase was about a 4%, including the enterprise funds. Now let me show you what we're looking at under the revised budgets that I just reviewed with you. The general fund overall budget increase is a 0. Across all funds, water, sewer, and solid waste, it's up 0.06%. This is not a slash and burn, cut to the bone, uninformed approach to budgeting, okay? This is disciplined with good data based on and following our financial policies, putting forward a budget that is absolutely balanced and solid sitting here today, but is a worst case scenario. Now, if things get better, if additional revenues become available, as we've already discussed, we can come back and revisit this budget in the fall, and we can reduce our reliance on one-time budgets, or we can add some things back into the budget. I'm going to put a plug in right now for the superintendent and myself. I would love to see the facilities director position put back. We had to cut that. That will help us with the capital budget to doing green repair projects at the schools and roofs and things of that nature. But that's for another time. And last but not least, if we get additional revenues coming in from the federal or state government, we can apply that to reduce further the tax impact felt by our residents. But let me be absolutely clear, sitting here today, no additional revenues materialize for us. We can move forward, approve this budget at town meeting, not hold a special town meeting in the fall, and we would be, barring things deteriorating further, we would be fine. Not fine, we'd be okay. We would then spend the balance of this year as we prepare for, in the fall, for fiscal 2022, which, by the way, is something I just want to touch upon right now. You know me, most of you have been through multiple sessions like this with me over the years. So as soon as we're worried about fiscal 21, but my focus and the superintendent's focus is on fiscal 2022. We believe that that might be a even more difficult year for us. As we see the drop in revenue, right? We see a drop that might get mitigated by some relief funds at the federal level. Unless those relief funds are replicated again in fiscal 2022, we may feel an even tighter pinch in 2022. If I shook the snow globe and you asked me what do I think based on the data and what I know about Northborough, my 17 years of working for the town and the last 2 recessions that I've managed through, I would say fiscal 21, we're going to be okay. It's going to pinch, it's going to be tight, but everybody working together, we're going to be okay. 2022 is going to be difficult. We're probably looking at 2023 before things kind of bottom out. And then maybe if there's a vaccine and things start looking good, we might start seeing the recovery for us, not the private sector, but the lag for us somewhere in 2024. So that's where my mindset is. That's where your mindset should be. So when we talk about like, why aren't you dipping into the stabilization and not cutting any budgets and increasing or maintaining services, we need to look at a good multi-year plan. And guys, I'm not there tonight. I don't have a revised 5-year projection for you tonight. I will have one for you in the fall. And we will spend a lot of time talking about that 5-year projection in December of 2020, just like we did in December of 2019. But sitting here today, we have giant holes in our data points. We don't even know how we're closing out fiscal 20 yet, because we allowed people more time to pay their tax bills. So we don't even have the data for the last month of tax collections. We don't know how the economy is going to reopen, how fast, and what those revenues are going to look like. We don't know what we're going to get for stimulus funds. We're not going to know really how this budget is going to shake out until probably September, October timeframe. So we can hold a special town meeting in the fall and make adjustments if things get worse, or make adjustments if things get better. But what you should feel comfortable with sitting here tonight is that the budget that we have put together to go to town meeting with is financially balanced. It's sensitive to the taxpayers, and it, by and large, preserves the core services that we care most about. So I want to talk just for a moment. I have 2 more slides, just for a moment, about moving forward. So tonight is a very important meeting. The whole point of tonight, just like back in December, as I said, is everybody sitting here, I want to know if you agree with everything I've said tonight. I want to know that you think that the assumptions that the financial team and the superintendent and I have put together aren't too rosy or too dire, that you see what we see, and that this makes sense to you as a policy board or committee. Because if it doesn't make sense to you, it's not going to make sense to the people at town meeting or the people at home that might be watching this, okay? That's the power of these types of joint meetings. But moving forward, the Board of Selectmen will hold a public hearing, because this meeting is for you. The meeting on the 8th is to hear the thoughts from the residents. And hopefully they have watched this presentation and a lot of their questions or concerns have been answered. But if not, they can certainly ask their questions of us on the 8th with the Appropriations Committee. On the 11th, the Appropriations Committee needs to vote their recommendations for town meeting regarding the school budgets and the general government budget. That's their job. That's what they'll do. Financial Planning already voted their recommendations. So the capital plan that we just reviewed, they're 100% unanimous with those moves. On the 15th, the Board of Selectmen will then review and take their votes and recommendations on the budget. And at that point, and this all builds. So Financial Planning does their work, makes their recommendations. The school committee does their work, makes their recommendations. The Appropriations Committee does their very detailed review, makes their recommendations. And then the Board of Selectmen relies on everything that all of you folks have done, and they either concur or disagree with your recommendations. Hopefully, if we've all done our jobs correctly, they agree and concur. And so on the 15th, the Selectmen would vote their recommendations. And this is on the revised stuff. Also on the 15th, as I said, we are going to do a layup. We will have a 1/12 budget, as Keith asked about. We will have a 1/12 budget for the board to approve and submit to DLS, so that on the chance that we don't get a quorum or something else happens and we are unable to hold town meeting on the 22nd, we can continue to function into the upcoming fiscal year. But we have agreement by all the policy boards and committee, which is what the Department of Revenue and the Division of Local Services wants to see. They want to make sure that if they approve the 1/12 budget, that the school committee isn't saying, hold on, that's not what we want. We just completely disagree. Okay. And so we're not in that situation because you've already taken your vote to agree that this is what we're doing. So that's the process moving forward. So in conclusion, now you guys were waiting to hear me say in conclusion, this is where we stand right here tonight. The general fund 2021 budget increase is a 0. And I want to be clear, that does not mean that the tax increase will be a 0. There will be a tax increase. I'm not prepared to tell you what that is because there's too much that needs to happen. I know we're going to get additional funding in some form from the federal government or the state. And when we get that, a good piece of that will be used to reduce the tax impact. But right now, the best we can do as a community is a general fund increase of 0. As I said earlier in the presentation, we plan for the worst, we hope for the best. This is not a make-believe budget. This is a straight up solid financial plan for fiscal 21. if the feds and the state do not come to the rescue of municipalities. It is a solid plan. We not only are not using any of our additional levy capacity, we're actually adding to levy capacity because our increase in taxes is going to be less than what's allowable under a basic standard Prop 2.5 increase. As I said before, we've nipped and we tucked, but our core departmental services, our personnel, and the mission of our departments has been protected in this budget. And I mentioned the tax impact. And then the last point, Tim Kalin from Board of Selectmen, Kalin is fond of saying, because he works with small businesses, and what do they need more than anything right now? They need money, flexibility, and time to maneuver. Well, we are a small business. We're a $70 million corporation, and we need time. We need to create flexibility for ourselves to get through this immediate crisis so that we can assess the data, get the data, which we don't have, but assess it and chart out a new course and a new plan for our community. And that will take place in the fall and in December, when we typically sit down and we review all the data, looking back 10 years, and you get a new forecast from me looking forward 5 years. We'll have that discussion. And just like tonight, we'll build consensus about where it is we say we want to go as a community. But right now, this budget gives us that flexibility. If we didn't have the policies that we put in place 10 years ago, if we didn't have the plan where we knew exactly where we would go in the event of a crisis or an unexpected recession, that we could hold off on capital, defer on OPEB, do all the things that we talked about tonight. If we didn't have those things available, we would be in the position that, frankly, most communities are in right now. Either knee-jerk, significant cuts and reductions in staff, or you have nothing you can do but sit and hope and pray that the federal government and the state government bail you out. And I don't mean that in a negative way, because there are a lot of managers that across the state that are as good or better than me, and their staff is as good or better than ours. But by virtue of the economics of their community, they might be poorer communities, or they might not have had the growth that we had. It's about what you make of your situation. So you can have people that don't earn a lot of money, but they're disciplined and they plan for retirement and they save and they take care of their assets, right? You can have somebody who has a lot of money, is very wealthy, and lives paycheck to paycheck, okay? That's where good management is the defining factor in the difference. When Moody's rates the town of Northborough, we get the maximum number of points in our bond rating for our policies, our management, and our track record for staying the course on these things. And so that's the difference of us and some of these other communities. We're in a much, much better place. So with that, I'll end my presentation. And again, on the second half, through the chair, I'm happy to answer any question that anybody has regarding the finances of the town of Northborough. Obviously, I'm very proud of our community. I'm proud of our boards and committees, because this is not the town administrator show. This is not the school committee show, and this is not the Board of Selectmen show. This is us as a community, all of us. The only way this works is if everybody is working together, which is what we have done. And the thing that I value, and this, I'm just going to make one statement here, guys. The things that I value as a manager above all else in this community is the positive relationships that I have with the superintendent, the positive relationships that we have created and cultured between all the boards and committees and the people that are here tonight. If we lose that culture and we go back to being divisive, those of you that have been around for a long time, you remember what it was like during that 2000 recession, and everybody was at each other's throats. It was us against them, the hell with the schools, and the police and fire were fighting, and the boards and committees couldn't agree on policies, okay? That has not been the case in Northborough in the 12 years that I've been your town administrator. I want to make sure, based on giving you good information and making sure that you have the information you need to make good, solid recommendations to town meeting and to your constituents, that's my job. And tonight, that's what I want to hear from you. Do you have the information? Are you comfortable with this? And by consensus, there's no votes. I don't want to find out at town meeting that Kelly or Lauren or Rick or any of you disagrees with the path that we've charted out. Because if you have a question or concern, let's work it out now as a group. That's the point of this meeting. The rest of it's formality, but that's what I'm looking for from you guys tonight. So with that, I talked way too much. I appreciate your indulgence. Listen, I love this stuff and I love this community. I have been a resident of this community for 22 years. My kids are in the schools. I rely on all the services like you. I want this place to be here when I'm gone. Not that I'm going anywhere, but this is lasting and real things that we've done here. And I appreciate all of your assistance and your indulgence tonight. I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I just want to thank you and Jason Little and our department heads for all the work that they've done over these last several weeks to try to bring us to a point that we can present this tonight and hopefully show enough detail about what the step forward is and how the budget would be structured for the next coming fiscal year. I also want to thank Superintendent Martineau and the school committee members and the school administration staff for the work they've done. And as you said, John, it's been a very collaborative effort to try to get us to this point. And certainly the efforts on the school side of things was as important to provide us with an appropriate budget. It's comprehensive in what it addresses. So thank you all for that. John, I am going to ask you to speak a little bit more.
I could do this all night. You guys want to get down to the weeds? I'm happy to do that. I'll pull out my trend monitoring. We'll talk about trends for the last 10 years.
As you were discussing the capital budget, you noted that more typically in past years, we've had a $500,000 contribution from free cash to the operating budget.
Yes.
And paired with that is retaining $500,000 in free cash unspent, so that for the following fiscal year, if we did not generate additional free cash, we would still have that $5,000 available to plug that hole in the operating budget and give us some time. For this revised presentation, as you mentioned, it's increased from 500 to 878 in the operating budget, while retaining another 888 in unspent free cash, basically for the same purpose. If we get to this point next year, revenue sources haven't materialized to plug that hole. We already have it in hand to apply to that. What I was going to ask you to do is that in particular was one of the key elements of our revised financial policies. And for contrast, I was going to ask you to kind of go back to the early to mid 2000s, what the practice was at that time and what we encountered at that time that showed us it was not the right thing to be doing.
Sure. Briefly, in not the last recession, but the recession before that, the early 2000, the 03, 04, we were using and rolling forward free cash, budget surplus from the prior year into the operating budget. And we did that because there was pressure for services. We didn't want to cut services. And so we, at our high point, we were using $1.4 million on a regular basis in the operating budget. So you finish out the prior year, and then you were rolling those one-time revenues, not spending them on one-time capital that you can defer. You're rolling it into the operating budget. And what happened with the town is we got caught. So if we were doing that right now, so instead of limiting one-time revenues in the operating budget to 1%, which is what we do, say we were using $1.5 million, and the pandemic hit, and now we need $2.5 million to stay where we are. Okay, we got caught. And when we got caught, the boards and committees together, and I actually went and I presented this to the school committee as well, the free cash policy. We decided that we were no longer going to use those one-time revenues at that level in the operating budget. And we spent 3 or 4 years dropping it down 800, 700, 600 to 500,000. And 500,000 at the time was about 1% of the operating budget. And there was a sense that was a reasonable amount to use in. But then we chose to use the balance of it to pay for school roofs and boilers and window replacements and DPW trucks and so forth, because as we did that, we were no longer charging the credit card. So what we saw is our debt service over time slid off. Why is that important? Well, as the debt service slid down, you create capacity in your operating budget to do what? I don't know, the Lincoln Street building project for one, right? Because overall, you got to manage your overall level of debt. And so what we did is we paid off our debt, and we don't not bringing it back in, except for these large projects like the fire station, Lincoln Street, the library, the senior center, those types of projects. But the point Jason's trying to make is when we didn't have that policy that everybody agreed to, and we were undisciplined, we got ourselves in trouble. And this is going back, to 2003, 2004. We have made sure that we didn't put ourselves in that position for the last recession or this one. So that's discipline. And again, I'll just going to share one very brief story. Elaine Kelly is not here tonight. Okay. She's the chair of, and has been the chair of the Appropriations Committee for over 20 years. I remember when I said, we need comprehensive financial policies, and I'm going to go present them. Joan, you were on the committee. I'm going to present these to the school committee, the free cash policy. And she said, why are you doing that? That's not their job. The Appropriations Committee's job, and Elaine's feisty. That's our job, is to have policies. Well, I had to remind everybody, a policy is not law, okay? Using free cash in the operating budget, it may not be a good financial practice, but it's perfectly legal. But I went to the school committee at the time, and I explained why we needed to get off that track. And the school committee at the school department, 70% of the budget, depending on how you slice it. So if we were going to cut our use of free cash, they were going to feel it, but they had to know why we were doing it and what it meant for the long-term stability and financial condition of the town. And I think anybody who spent the time on a school committee like Joan has knows, Joan, what's happened? We've put roofs on Peasley, put roof on Proctor. We replaced the boilers in the Malcolm Middle School. We're making handicapped accessibility. We're improving parking lot. We're investing more now over the last 10 years in our schools than we did in the prior 10 years without increasing the tax impact and without impacting the operating budgets. That's good policy, but they had to agree to it. So policy does not have the force of law. Policy is what we're doing here tonight, guys. It's consensus, it's collaboration, and it's communication, endless communication. And again, I'm going to come back to this again. Greg Martineau, I could not ask for a better partner in this. There's no other superintendent I want to go through this crisis with than Greg. He has been at our doorstep from day one, day in and day out, working to find solutions. He could have just as easily said, hey, I'm here to represent the schools. We want the money. The rest of it comes out of the general government side. That's how things used to happen in Northborough, going way back. We haven't had that in 12 years, guys. So we need to stay disciplined. We need to make sure we have good, experienced people on boards and committees to balance the new people coming in so that folks can educate themselves and learn this. You can be extremely educated and have a lot of finance background. Municipal finance is not private sector finance. It takes time to learn the lingo, but the principles are the same. As I've had this conversation with Tim Kalin over and over again, the principles are the same. Making sure you're dealing with your unfunded liabilities, investing in your capital, having appropriate reserves to deal with unexpected things, and living within your means. Those are all things that we have done in a disciplined way for the last 10 years. And that is why we have the highest bond rating that in the town's history right now. And I anticipate when we go out, just like we did for Lincoln Street School Building Project, when we go out for our fire station project, I fully anticipate that our bond rating will hold, regardless of what happens. I shouldn't say this stuff like this, but or regardless, unless things go really, really bad, our bond rating will hold because we're disciplined on all those fronts.
Thank you, John. I'll take another swing through for questions. First, the Board of Selectmen, if you could physically raise a hand if you have a question. People are flopping around here. Julianne Hirsch. Yep.
Well, first of all, thank you for that very comprehensive presentation. It was really great. And I just have a couple of detailed questions. In our May 18th packet, when we received the draft budget, the revision, there was an item, fire station debt service, and it was listed as $105,828. And I guess that was even down from the February amount that you had wanted. And then in the latest, in our new packet, it says the fire station debt service is for only $17,098. Can you tell me, has something changed about the project?
Sure. I mean, let me answer that. I'd love to answer that question. So when we put the original budget together for fiscal 21, we anticipated that in March, in April, that we would be moving forward, hiring the architect and hiring the owner's project manager to start working on that project for this upcoming fiscal year cycle. Pandemic hit, nobody was meeting. And so because we didn't move forward with that, so in order for me to engage the architect and the owner's project manager in fiscal 20, the year that we're in right now, I would then have to carry and plan for a debt service for that portion in fiscal 21. But simply now, because we are going to be engaging that all you do is cross from June 30th to July 1, and that expense now for that pay down would now come in fiscal 2022. So that's what's happened. And then in the initial pass, the finance director, Jason Little, we put a plug number in for what we thought issuance costs would be, and that's the 100,000 figure or so. And then we since have been able to get actual costs, and it's down to like $17,000. This is another way that we have just created a little bit of capacity in the fiscal 2021 budget. But the project is still on the same track. Well, it's not on the exact same track because we lost several months because of the pandemic. And that's just the nature. There's a lot of projects and things. I mean, have we done anything except work on the COVID-19 and revised budgets? Keep in mind, all the budget work was done. We were ready to move forward to town meeting. May, June, that's when we start moving on building projects and start planning our initiatives for the fall. All that stuff has been hit with a delay, and that's just a matter of how things have played out.
Okay, and thank you. So, and then there's another question on there's a sheet that came with our packet. It says Department FY 2020, 2021. Under advisory boards and services with personnel board,
yep,
there's an increase from $13,444 to $79,975.
Yeah.
There must be something.
Yeah. So
major.
again, we're getting into, and I'm happy to answer the question, but we're getting into the nitty gritty of the general government side of the budget. I'm happy to answer it, but let me do it quickly. Personnel board account is our centralized account. When we are going to, when we in a negotiation, so we have anticipated personnel costs, particularly when we're in negotiations, that's where you put the money. And that's where we hold the money for the wage increases for under the contracts, so merit increases. And then during the course of the year, so it starts off there. Then the course of the year, when you settle a contract or you or people obtain merit, it transfers out of there and goes and is reflected in the departmental budgets themselves. So that's why that's one of those accounts that's always being transferred around, because it's held centrally. And then when contracts are settled or merit increases are awarded, they're transferred into the departmental budgets. And that's why that account, you'll see some years where that account is $350,000 or more. And then it moves over. School department has a similar account that they hold the funds in for. That I bet you there's an account right now that you're holding money in for settled contracts. So that's ours.
Okay, and just one more question.
Yep.
I would really like to see the ability for residents to email questions for Monday night for public comments. I know it's a little late, the agenda went out, but is there a way of setting up that COVID email again?
No, they can go on and go to town admin and just send the comments through there, and they'll come straight to my admin and we'll compile them.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah. And
All
again,
right.
Monday the 8th is a public hearing, so you can send in questions, but or call in with questions. Either way, just like we did when we did the COVID-19, we'll take all the questions and we'll answer them.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're
That's it for
welcome.
me.
Thank you, Julian. Any other members of the Board of Selectmen, please raise your hand physically. Leslie Rattan.
Hi, John, I also want to thank you and Jason Little and actually everybody on this meeting. Everybody's had a part to play, and I know you spent a lot of hours in meetings, a lot of long days, and a lot of long evenings, and I know it's a lot of work, and it's very much appreciated. This is an excellent presentation. One thing I was wondering is, can we possibly, maybe for just upcoming meetings or information that is downloaded onto the town website for residents, is there a way to overlay the revised proposed budget over the previous proposed budget so that people can see more clearly and more quickly what the changes were? I think, if anything that people are talking about is a budget and how can we possibly be spending any more money at this time? And I think people want to be able to quickly digest what they're seeing, as
Sure.
opposed to seeing a lot of numbers being thrown at them and have to kind of look at a couple different things and try and figure out where is the difference. So
Yeah,
I'm wondering, would that be possible to do that so that when you're eyeballing this thing during a meeting or online, it's easy to see what the changes were that were made to come up with this revised proposed budget?
Yeah, and that's really what I attempted to do with this presentation tonight. This presentation will be on the town administrator's website tomorrow. And now keep in mind now, what we're talking about here tonight, when I say the general fund budget, that's the big spending plan that includes all the schools, the capital, and the general government. Each individual entity, this thing all builds up from the departments to the full general fund spending plan that goes to town meeting. So the superintendent on his website has his presentations regarding the revised budget. I've got the memo with all the detail on ours. And tonight, this is why, and Jason and I, the finance director, Jason Little and I, had a lot of discussions about, the length of this presentation, frankly. But we decided to do exactly what you said. We're showing you the general fund budget, and then on the next slide, the revised budget, the capital budget, and on the next slide, the revised. And so this will be available on the website tomorrow. People can go to it, look at it, and get that information.
Yeah, and I think that's great, but I'm wondering whether it could be consolidated even more so, where on one sheet you see the original and then you see the revised kind of together, so you see the percentage decrease immediately without having to go back and forth, because this is excellent information and I think it would just be easy to digest if it was compiled or condensed a little bit that way.
So let me just say this. I'm happy to provide any information, any format that anybody wants. We can do that. It's going to get confusing because when we talk about percentages, now you got to remember you had the fiscal 20 budget, right? Then you had the fiscal 21 level service budget
right
from March, and then you have this revised budget. So when you calculate the percentages, do you want me to calculate the percentages from the increase from the fiscal 20 budget or off the 23 budget? We actually have working spreadsheets that we've done. It's very confusing.
Yeah, I can see
so
that.
This, in my opinion, is the most straightforward way to show it. And that way we're consistently talking about what percentage, because when we're talking about reductions, we're talking about percentage reductions from the previously proposed budget, not necessarily from the fiscal 20 budget. Because overall, it still is an increase on fiscal 20, but it's a decrease from the originally proposed budget. It's a lot of numbers, guys. So we can give that some thought.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Leslie. Any other members of the Board of Selectmen, please raise a physical hand. Yes, Don Rand.
Okay, mine's just a comment. I was very concerned when I saw the stabilization fund was not getting contributed to, John, but I think you did a very smart move by putting into the Appropriations Committee reserve fund. So that really took care of my concerns. So I want to thank you for the presentation and all the thought that's gone into it, and just make that comment that it's nice to keep it available. So that concludes my comments.
Through the
Thank you,
chair, if
Don.
I may just follow up,
Sure.
Dawn, and the real beauty of that move, it still stays in our reserves. We're not spending it. It just moves it to make it accessible to us in case we run into a problem. But the beauty of it is because we've worked with the superintendent and the school committee to reduce the budgets, that regular contribution and the stabilization is designed to maintain the ratio between 8 and 9%. Because we've reduced our budgets, it's still in that ratio. But even if we spend it, we're still well within our policy. I would feel 100% confident meeting with Moody's to do a rating analysis on the town of Northborough, explain what we did, and they'd say, that was a good move. That makes perfect sense.
Thank you, John. And if there are no other questions from the Board of Selectmen, I'll move to the Appropriations Committee. Any Appropriations Committee members, please raise a physical hand. I'm not seeing any hands, so I will move to the Financial Planning Committee. Financial Planning Committee members, please raise a physical hand if you have a question. Once again, I see no hands. I'll go to the School Committee. School Committee members. I have two. Joan Frank.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to say that I think John hit upon it, my tenure on the board, and I have seen in his 12 years as being here, the cooperation and the collaboration between the superintendents that we have had at our helm and also with John and all the boards, but it also extends to all the boards that are present here tonight. And I think one thing that is unseen is the tour of the buildings that takes place in the fall. And I remember the one that we all took. All the boards that are here are invited to it. And we took the tour of the buildings, the school buildings, to see what would be potential capital plans. So I think that cooperation, something that's unseen, is also a result of what we have today, because we can share how we're going to pay for those through the free cash or whatever it means. My question is to either to Greg or to John, is just to help to educate the public when on the capital plans. The one for the schools, which is the Melican Middle School, the walkway, that was reduced from 100,000 to 50,000. And I know we talked about the parking lot, we talked about the handicap access because it's voting. We also talked about the walkway in the back because of the rocks and the tree stumps coming up. So my question is, and I'm hoping that maybe somebody in the public has a question and wants to know, and could you answer it? With the decrease, what are we eliminating from on that capital project at the Melican Middle School?
A great question. We're eliminating nothing. What's happening is, working with the superintendent and the DPW director, we have agreed to absorb the other 50,000 in our roadway maintenance budget. So we will do the full project, the walkway improvements, the handicapped accessible. That's what's the 50,000, because that has to get done. And as far as the parking lot improvements and the restriping and the other work, the other 50,000, we're going to do that out of the DPW's operating budget.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, because I thought maybe this, I didn't see the other 50,000 going into future years, and I was wondering, what are we doing? So that just highlights another thing of the cooperation and collaboration of working together. So thank you to all the boards present tonight, and to our superintendent, and to you, John. Thank you so very much, because I think this has allowed us to ride the wave during this pandemic and to remain calm. And also thank you as a citizen for all the email communications that came from your boards to update us on delays, things that were not taking place, like with the summer music program at the park, and the delay in the recreation, because that goes out to the people that are affected by school-age kids looking for activities that will not be there this summer. So I appreciate all those updates and keeping us so very well informed. So thank all the other departments that are not here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Kelly Gwinnett, I think you had a question also.
I did, thank you. So Joan and I are kind of on the same page. That part was my question, was about Melican. So that was part of it. And then the other is also goes with the expenditures, and it's just, again, town related and questions for, I'm assuming other people are gonna have clarification, is the Assabet Park. I'm assuming that didn't change because of the community preservation part of it.
Right.
And then the feasibility study of the town hall. So just those two, if there's any further explanation on those, that would be appreciated.
Sure. So let me start with the town hall. So we're going to get what's referred to as the old town hall, 4 West Main Street in the center. We'll revert back to the town in 2022. We need to know what we're doing with it. And we can't wait until it comes back to us to then go, oh, now that we have it, what do we do? So the building that we're in right now, we have, I won't say we've deferred maintenance on it, but all of its systems are at the end of their useful life. And so we either need to put several $1 million into the 63 Main Street right now, and it's been in the capital plan for more than 6 years. And we've delayed and we've done some improvements, but we need to either invest in this building, look at moving potentially to 4 West Main Street, or building new. And so the feasibility study, that's what it's designed to do. I'll take you back to the Lincoln Street building project. What did we do? We did a feasibility study. What did the feasibility study look at? Renovating, addition, moving, building new, right? So the feasibility study looks at all of your options and gets you cost estimates. And you're doing this with architects and engineers to give you good information upon which to make an informed decision. So that's what that feasibility study is. And that has to take place, or we're not going to have the information. We're going to find ourselves having to make decisions without information to move forward. So that's why that's still in there. As the Assabet Park, that's a great one. Assabet Park, as you may know, we actually had a complaint filed for ADA compliance at Assabet Park. Assabet Park was redesigned 23 years or so ago. I didn't have anything to do with it. I didn't do anything to the park, but somebody filed a complaint. It went to the Architectural Access Board in Boston. And the Architectural Access Board took the position that because we replaced the mulch, that we have improved the park, and therefore the park needs to come into compliance with today's standards. Okay, that's a very liberal interpretation, and we appealed it. But when we appealed it, before we appealed it, I went and made a presentation to them. I showed them the 6-year capital plan. I put it 2 years out, and I said, here's our thought process. What we have to do, what would comply, is that we pay a rubberized path around the play equipment at Assabet Park. That costs $100,000 to do that, and that provides accessibility around the equipment. And what I said to the board was, well, that's great. So now some child who has mobility issues can wheel up and stare at a piece of equipment that they can't play on. Does that make sense to you? Plus, I'm spending $100,000 to put a nice new rubberized path around 25-year-old play equipment. I said, give us a couple of years and we'll do a whole renovation. And if we're going to do it, let's do it right, because the town of Northborough doesn't like to waste money on capital projects. We don't want to spend $100,000 and then 5 or 6 years from now, pull out the aging equipment and replace it. They were not reasonable. And so we appealed to court. We actually appealed the decision and laid out our reason for why. They came back to us and we negotiated a settlement. They gave us 2 years to put this together. I said, why do I need time? Well, I need to convey and convince the Community Preservation Committee to do it. We want to look for grants. We want to obtain donations. That's why I was looking for a little bit more time. They said, no, we're going to give you 18 months. Actually, they gave me 6 months to comply originally. Then they said, well, we'll give you 18 months. And that's what we settled on. And that project has to move forward to comply with that court settlement, or that agreed upon has to move forward. Now, here's the thing to keep in mind. The 100,000 roughly that's in the general fund, the free cash, if nothing else happens, we have to put that rubberized path around that old equipment. The community preservation funds are already baked into your tax bill, right? That's the surcharge on every tax bill every year. So if you decide not to do that project, it will not reduce your tax rate. It just means the money that you've already handed over to the town for community preservation projects will just sit in an account. So that money is there, the free cash is there. We can, for a little over $500,000, we can do a holistic revision to that park and not make it just handicapped accessible to wheel up to it, but a child and a parent with mobility issues will have equipment that is accessible to. That makes sense to me. That's the type of planning that we do. And so we partnered with community preservation. We moved it up on their schedule. We moved it up on our capital plan. We got the Architectural Access Board in Boston to agree with it. Look, if push came to shove, we would have appealed it because I don't think that changing mulch, you know, when you have an old building, if you modify or make improvements beyond a certain percentage, the whole building has to come up with today's current codes, okay? That makes sense, okay? If I was replacing all the equipment or even a portion of the equipment, I would understand the argument. But the mulch, we're gonna have to agree to disagree on that. Put that aside though. What's the right thing to do for the community? What's the right thing to do for the residents? We have an aging park. The equipment needs to be replaced. Let's redesign it. Let's get rid of the basketball courts where you have teenagers, you know, with preschool age kids in close proximity. We have plenty of basketball courts for teenagers. We want to make that whole area dead. It's our only park for preschool age kids. Let's redo it right, fix the equipment, update it, and make it accessible so children that have mobility issues don't just wheel up and watch their friends play. They can get on the equipment and use it. That's inclusiveness. That's the type of planning that we do in Northborough, and that's what that project is. And that's why it's still going forward at this town meeting. So if somebody took exception to that and they voted against the community preservation portion of the funds, we will have no obligation. We're under court order. We're going to have to put money into an aging rubberized thing. So put that aside. It's the right thing to do. And by the way, that project in its entirety can be approved by town meeting and will have no additional tax impact. So win all around. It's a good stuff.
And so would that be happening this year?
That will happen by the fall.
Okay. Great.
Yep. So it would get approved. The funding would become available right away, and it would be constructed and would be completed. I can't remember the exact date. It will be completed in calendar year 2020 though. So
thank you.
Can I just come back I just want to go back to Joan and Kelly's comment about the Melican Middle School parking lot. A good chunk of that 100,000 originally was for engineering, design, and construction administration oversight. The DPW director has agreed to take that on his personal time or his town time to do that. And that's one of the ways we're able to fit that in. So the DPW director, rather than it'd be like the DPW director coming over and being the contract administrator for this project, that's the way that we can fit it. We're using some of our roadway maintenance to crack seal that parking lot, you know, like we do for any municipal facility, but the oversight, the $10,000 or $15,000 of engineering and oversight, our DPW director has agreed to take that on in the spirit of collaboration because he wanted to see that project get done. And the school superintendent identified it and the school committee identified it as a priority. I want to be responsive to that.
Please give him our sincere thanks for helping, and because it's a win-win for everybody, for every resident that walks on that path in the back of the school. You know, the voting now designated at Melican so that we do not have to rent ramps, but we'll have the accessibility closer in the cuts in the curbs for the handicapped. So it's for our seniors, it's for the handicapped, for the children, and for everybody. But that's another thing, as I'll say, I keep saying collaboration and cooperation between everybody who's here tonight. Thank you so much. And it's very important that we do those tours of the school so we can see the capital projects and educate everybody what we need. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Joe. Lauren, yes, question.
Thank you so much. So one of my biggest fears is that we've done all of this work. We've amended all the budgets, and we go to town meeting and something as basic as not reaching quorum happens due to the pandemic. So what safety measures are being put in place, and can people participate virtually?
Okay, so little off, great question. Not really for tonight. On the Selectmen's meeting on Monday, if you look at the agenda, we'll be talking about the logistics of town meeting. But I just want to come back. Part of the comment is appropriate right here, and that is if we don't get a quorum, what happens? Well, that's our belts and suspenders. We have a 1/12 budget that'll be approved by the Board of Selectmen on the 15th. The schools and the departments will continue providing the services that they provided because of all the work that you all have done to get us to this point. We have an agreed upon budget, so we'll be able to make the argument for the 1/12 of the revised budget, and we'll be able to proceed. But I got to give Scott Charpentier a shout out here, a DPW director. He has taken it upon himself to measure out, working with the superintendent staff, Mike Gorman, to measure out and plan the whole layout and how it would work. I'll just say this for tonight. Between the gym and the auditorium is seating capacity for 3,650 people. We get, for the average for the last 5 years for town meeting, is 288 people. Okay, the highest point, 2016, was 400 people, 416 people. We're planning for 400 people. But I share your concern is we need to get at least 100 for the quorum. So, but I think we're going to be able to do that. And I think if we're smart about how we handle it, that people will feel comfortable coming in. A perfect example, the auditorium holds 800 people. Under this plan, we're talking about 80 people. So somebody on either end of the row, right? Skip 2 rows and somebody in the middle. Skip 2 rows, somebody on either end of the row. That's the kind of social distancing that we're talking about. We want people to feel safe to come because we do need to conduct the business of the town. If for some reason we can't, or it doesn't work, or we don't get a quorum, we have a backup plan.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Lauren. Any questions from town staff or Superintendent Martineau?
Well, I'll let Greg go. I've done enough talking, but I do have one comment I'd like to make through the chair. But
okay.
I just want to echo John's comments around collaboration. I know he said it several times, but this is my first year as superintendent, and there's a long tradition of collaboration from prior superintendents who've paved the way. So I just want to acknowledge that, and it's not something that I created, it's something that I stepped into, and my hope is to continue that for the years to come.
Thank you, Greg.
Through
John?
the chair, I do need to call out Jason Little, who's here tonight, our finance director. I always say I get the pleasure of pointing at doing these presentations. Jason was here through the weekend. He was here 9 o'clock last night. He was here last weekend and the weekend before that with me, doing yeoman-like work to get us here. There is no way that I could be here tonight and speak with any kind of confidence without the work that he's done for us to get us to this point. So I do want to specifically call him out for the great job that he's done. A massive asset for the community. And again, it's that historic understanding and that culture of knowing that we're all working together. So I just want to acknowledge Jason and all the hard work that he's done. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jason. Appreciate all the effort and all the long hours over these last several weeks. It's wearing on everybody, but it's just amazing that people have managed to persevere through it and bring us to this point with this kind of quality information to work with. So thank you. I'll just throw it open to anybody at all. Raise a physical hand if you have any final question.
They're afraid I might start talking again. Nobody wants to ask anything now.
I couldn't tell Janice Height. Were you waving a hand?
Going to suggest that since we have another meeting Monday night, that we continue this discussion then.
Very good. I don't see any other questions or hands raised, so I think we're at the conclusion. Any final comments, John?
No.
Okay. So as we've explained, this was the most detailed and lengthy presentation, trying to hit all aspects of the revision of the budget. This information, all the information will be up on the website tomorrow. You should have the video replay of this meeting available. I encourage everyone to watch it and go through the information that's been presented in preparation for Monday's joint meeting, Board of Selectmen and Appropriations holding a public hearing on the budget. The material presented that evening will not be as detailed. So we encourage everyone to prepare beforehand to make themselves as knowledgeable as possible and have their questions prepared. As Selectman Julian Hirsch asked, if you would like to submit any questions for public input by email, you can send those to the town administrator email. Go to the town website, go to the administration page, and you should find a link for town administration or Diane Wackel and submit your question there, and we will consolidate all those and have those at the meeting on Monday to try to respond to all of those questions. With that, I think we are concluded. Do I have a motion from a Board of Selectmen member? Don? Sorry, Don, you're muted.
Move we adjourn.
Second.
Motion to adjourn, moved and seconded. Any discussion? Seeing none, it's by roll call. Julianne?
Aye.
Leslie?
Aye.
Tim?
Aye.
Dawn?
Aye.
And I vote aye. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much. Good
Thank
night.
you, everybody.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.